I speak to all wild wolves, the young Apache said proudly. The rich rancher laughs, but gets shocked. The crack of Winchester rifle fire shattered the desert dawn like thunder splitting stone. Theodore Morrison's weathered hands gripped the smoking barrel as the last coyote fell among the scattered bones of what had once been his prize, Hereford bull. 3 days of tracking, 3 days of watching his livestock disappear into the unforgiving wilderness of the Arizona Territory, and now this grisly discovery in the shadow of the Chiricahua Mountains. "Damn it to hell," Morrison muttered, his steel-gray eyes surveying the carnage spread across the rocky canyon floor. The bull had been worth more than most men earned in 6 months, and now it was nothing but sun-bleached ribs and torn hide decorating the desert like some macabre sculpture. His foreman, Jake Patterson, dismounted nearby, his face pale beneath his sweat-stained hat. "That's the 4th head of cattle this week, boss," Patterson said, kneeling to examine the massive paw prints pressed deep into the sandy earth. "But these tracks, they ain't like nothing I ever seen. Too big for coyotes, wrong shape for mountain lions." Morrison spat into the dust and adjusted his black Stetson against the climbing sun. At 52 years old, he had built his ranching empire through sheer force of will and an absolute refusal to back down from any challenge, whether it came in the form of Apache war parties, territorial disputes, or acts of God himself. He had not clawed his way up from a dirt-poor sharecropper's son in East Texas to become one of the most powerful men in the Arizona Territory by allowing wild animals to steal his property. "Whatever they are, they're about to learn what happens when they mess with Theodore Morrison's livestock," he growled, reloading the Winchester with practiced efficiency. "Round up the boys. We're going hunting." But as Patterson mounted his horse to carry out the order, a sound drifted down from the high canyon walls that made both men freeze in their saddles. It was not quite a howl, not quite a human voice, but something that seemed to bridge the gap between the two worlds. The sound echoed off the red stone cliffs, multiplying and growing until it filled the entire canyon with its haunting resonance. Morrison's horse shifted nervously beneath him, ears twitching at frequencies beyond human hearing. "What in the Sam Hill was that?" Before Patterson could answer, a figure appeared on the ridge above them, silhouetted against the burning Arizona sky like a specter conjured from the desert itself. The man stood perfectly still on the narrow ledge, his long black hair streaming in the wind, and even at a distance of several hundred yards, there was something about his posture that spoke of absolute fearlessness. "Apache," Patterson whispered, his hand instinctively moving toward the Colt revolver on his hip. "Thought the cavalry had cleared them all out of this territory." Morrison squinted upward, studying the lone figure with the calculating gaze that had served him well in countless business negotiations. The Indian appeared young, probably no more than 20, but there was an authority in his stance that suggested wisdom far beyond his years. More troubling was the complete lack of concern he showed at being discovered by 2 armed white men in what was now legally Morrison's territory. "Well, well," Morrison called out, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Looks like we got ourselves a trespasser, Jake. Indian boy thinks he can waltz onto my land whenever he pleases." The figure on the ridge did not respond immediately, but when he did move, it was with the fluid grace of water flowing over stone. He began to descend the treacherous cliff face with impossible ease, finding handholds and footholds where none should have existed, moving with the confidence of a man who had spent his entire life in harmony with this harsh landscape. As he drew closer, Morrison could make out more details. The Apache wore traditional buckskin clothing that had been crafted with obvious care, and a single eagle feather hung from a leather cord near his left ear. His features were sharp and proud, with high cheekbones and dark eyes that seemed to hold secrets older than the mountains themselves. Most unsettling of all was the complete absence of weapons. No rifle, no bow, not even a knife that Morrison could see. "You are Theodore Morrison," the young Apache said as his feet touched the canyon floor. It was not a question, but a statement delivered with quiet certainty. His English was flawless, though touched with an accent that spoke of a first language far older than any European tongue. Morrison felt a chill run down his spine despite the desert heat. How could this Indian possibly know his name? They had never met, and Morrison made it a point to avoid unnecessary contact with the scattered remnants of the Apache tribes that still clung to existence in the remote corners of the territory. "That's right, boy. And this here is my land, bought and paid for legal-like from the territorial government. Which means you're trespassing." Morrison kept his rifle trained casually in the Apache's direction, not quite threatening, but making his position clear. "You got business here. You better state it quick before I decide to enforce property law the hard way." The young Apache regarded him with those unnervingly calm dark eyes for a long moment before speaking. "My name is Iana. It means eternal blossom in the language of my people. And you are wrong about one thing, Mr. Morrison. This land cannot be owned by papers signed in distant offices by men who have never walked these sacred paths." Patterson shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. There was something about the Indian's voice, a quality that seemed to resonate from somewhere deep within the earth itself. It was the kind of voice that made a man want to listen, even when he disagreed with every word being spoken. "Sacred paths?" Morrison laughed, though the sound came out harsher than he had intended. "Boy, the only thing sacred about this land is the $3,000 I paid for it. Your people lost their claim to this territory fair and square, according to the laws of the United States of America. That's how civilization works." Iana tilted his head slightly, as if listening to sounds that neither Morrison nor Patterson could hear. "Civilization," he repeated softly. "Is that what you call it when you take without asking, when you destroy without understanding, when you silence voices that have sung in these canyons for 1,000 summers? I call it progress." Morrison snapped, his patience wearing thin. "Your ancestors had their chance to make something of this land, and they failed. Now it's our turn. That's the natural order of things." The young Apache's expression did not change, but something shifted in the air around them, a tension that made the horses prance nervously, and the desert winds seemed to whisper warnings in languages long forgotten by the modern world. "The natural order," Iana mused. "Tell me, Mr. Morrison, what do you know of the natural order? Do you know why your cattle have been dying? Do you know what hunts in these canyons when the moon is dark and the spirits of the ancient ones walk the earth?" Morrison felt his grip tighten on the Winchester. This was getting into territory he did not like. Talk of spirits and ancient ones and other Indian superstition nonsense. But the boy's absolute confidence was unsettling, especially given the recent mysterious deaths of his livestock. "I know enough to recognize wolf's sign when I see it," Morrison said, gesturing toward the paw prints in the sand. "And I know wolves can be killed same as any other animal. Might take more bullets than usual for ones this size, but the principle remains the same." Iana followed his gaze to the tracks, and for the first time since appearing on the ridge, he smiled. It was not a pleasant expression, but neither was it cruel. Instead, it carried a mixture of sadness and amusement, as if he were watching a child play with forces far beyond their comprehension. "You think these are ordinary wolves?" he said, kneeling to place his hand directly over one of the massive paw prints. The print was easily 6 inches across, larger than any wolf track Morrison had ever seen or heard described. "You think your Winchester and your territorial papers give you dominion over forces that were ancient when your ancestors were still afraid of crossing the Great Water." Patterson leaned forward in his saddle, squinting at the print under Iana's hand. "Jesus Christ, boss. Look at that track. I seen grizzly bears leave smaller prints than that." Morrison dismounted and moved closer, keeping the rifle ready, but allowing curiosity to override caution. As he approached, he could see that Patterson was right. The track was enormous, far larger than any normal predator should produce. But more disturbing were the other details he had missed from horseback. The print was perfectly preserved in the sand despite the constant desert wind, as if it had been protected by some invisible force. And around the edges of the track, the sand had taken on a strange crystalline quality, as though it had been subjected to intense heat. "What kind of animal makes a track like that?" Morrison asked, though he was not entirely sure he wanted to know the answer. Iona rose to his feet with fluid grace, his dark eyes reflecting something that might have been ancient starlight. "Not animal," he said simply. "Spirit made flesh. Guardian of the old places, keeper of the sacred trust between the world of men and the world that lies beyond the veil of ordinary sight." "More Indian mumbo-jumbo," Morrison said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. The track at his feet was real enough, and so were the dead cattle scattered throughout his territory. Whatever was responsible for the killings was no ordinary predator. "You do not believe," Iona observed, and there was neither surprise nor judgment in his tone. "Your people have forgotten how to see with eyes other than those of flesh and blood. You have forgotten that the world is larger and stranger than your books and laws pretend." Morrison straightened, reasserting his authority through sheer force of will. "What I believe in is facts and evidence and the rule of law. And the fact is, something's been killing my cattle, and the law says I have the right to protect my property by any means necessary." The young Apache nodded slowly, as if he had expected this response. "Then perhaps it is time for you to meet the guardians face to face. Perhaps it is time for you to understand what you have awakened by bringing iron and fire into their domain." Without warning, Iona threw back his head and opened his mouth, releasing a sound that no human throat should have been capable of producing. It was part howl, part song, part prayer, rising and falling in complex harmonies that seemed to speak directly to some primal part of the human soul. The sound echoed off the canyon walls, growing and multiplying until it filled the entire desert with its otherworldly resonance. Morrison felt the hair on the back of his neck stand on end as the call continued, and his horse began to prance and snort in obvious distress. Patterson's mount actually reared, forcing the cowboy to fight for control as the animal tried to bolt from whatever presence it sensed approaching. When Iona's voice finally fell silent, the desert seemed to hold its breath. For several heartbeats, nothing moved except the nervous shifting of the horses and the distant circling of a red-tailed hawk high above the canyon rim. Then the answer came. It began as a whisper of sound carried on the desert wind, so faint that Morrison almost convinced himself he was imagining it. But the whisper grew stronger, joined by other voices, until the entire canyon resonated with a chorus of howls that spoke of ancient hunts under starless skies and territories marked not by surveyors' stakes, but by laws written in blood and moonlight. Patterson's face had gone white as desert sand. "Boss, there's a whole pack up there. Sounds like dozens of them." Morrison strained his eyes against the harsh morning light, scanning the rocky ledges and shadowed crevices that honeycombed the canyon walls. At first, he saw nothing, just the familiar landscape of red stone and twisted juniper that he had come to think of as his property. But gradually, shapes began to resolve themselves from the shadows, shapes that moved with predatory grace along impossible paths, shapes that were far larger than any wolves had a right to be. "Sweet Mother of God," he whispered as the first of the creatures became clearly visible on a ledge perhaps 200 feet above them. It was indeed a wolf, but unlike any wolf Morrison had ever seen or imagined. The animal stood nearly 4 feet at the shoulder, its massive frame rippling with muscle beneath a coat of fur so white it seemed to capture and reflect sunlight like fresh snow. But most unsettling were its eyes, not the typical yellow or amber of common wolves, but a pale, ethereal blue that seemed to hold intelligence far beyond mere animal cunning. More shapes appeared along the canyon rim, emerging from hidden dens and secret paths, like spirits materializing from the stone itself. 5 wolves, then 8, then more than Morrison could count with certainty. All of them were the same impossible white, all of them larger than nature should allow, and all of them watching the humans below with that same uncanny intelligence. "This ain't possible," Patterson stammered, his revolver half drawn but forgotten in his trembling hand. "Wolves this size, they'd need to eat a horse every day just to survive. There ain't enough game in the whole territory to support a pack like this." Ayanna stood perfectly still in the center of the canyon floor, his arms slightly outstretched as if embracing the presence of the great white shapes above. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly despite being barely above a whisper. "They are not sustained by ordinary food," he said, his gaze fixed on the largest of the wolves, the alpha female who stood at the very edge of the highest ledge like a queen surveying her domain. "They feed on the life force of the land itself, on the spiritual energy that flows through all sacred places. They are the guardians appointed by the Great Spirit to protect what must not be destroyed." Morrison forced his rational mind to reassert control over his growing fear. He was a practical man, a successful businessman who had built his fortune by dealing with facts rather than fantasies. There had to be a logical explanation for what he was seeing. "Guardians or not, they're just animals," he said, raising the Winchester toward the nearest visible wolf. "And animals can be killed." But before he could take proper aim, Ayanna stepped directly into his line of fire, those dark eyes blazing with something that might have been fury or sorrow or terrible ancient knowledge. "You still do not understand," the young Apache said, and for the first time, there was genuine emotion in his voice, a mixture of frustration and pity that cut Morrison more deeply than anger would have. "These are not mere animals to be hunted and killed. They are the living embodiment of treaties signed not with ink and paper, but with blood and spirit and the sacred breath of the eternal sky." The largest of the white wolves had begun to descend from her perch, moving down the cliff face with impossible grace. Even at a distance, Morrison could see the sheer size of the creature, the power contained in every fluid movement. This was no ordinary predator, but something that belonged to an older, wilder world than the one he thought he understood. "I speak to all wild wolves," Ayanna said proudly, his voice carrying across the canyon like a challenge thrown down before the forces of civilization itself. The words seemed to hang in the desert air, defying everything Morrison believed about the natural order, about the relationship between man and beast, about the very nature of reality itself. Morrison heard himself laugh, though the sound came out strained and uncertain. "You speak to wolves? Is that what you're telling me, boy? You got some kind of magic Indian power that lets you talk to animals." But even as the words left his mouth, Morrison could see the great white shapes moving closer, descending paths that should have been impossible for creatures of their size. They moved with purpose and intelligence, responding to some signal he could not perceive, coordinating their movements with the precision of a military unit. And in the center of it all stood Ayanna, perfectly calm and utterly fearless, as if he were surrounded by old friends rather than the largest predators Morrison had ever seen. The young Apache raised his face toward the morning sky once more, and when he opened his mouth, what emerged was not human speech but something else entirely, a complex vocalization that seemed to contain layers of meaning beyond the reach of ordinary language. The white wolves answered immediately, their voices joining as in a harmony that raised every hair on Morrison's body and sent his horse dancing backward in terror. It was not mere howling, but something that resembled singing, a form of communication that spoke of bonds deeper than pack loyalty or territorial instinct. "Jesus Christ," Patterson whispered, his voice barely audible over the supernatural chorus echoing through the canyon. "He really is talking to them. They're actually answering him." Morrison felt the Winchester grow heavy in his hands, as the reality of what he was witnessing began to penetrate his rational defenses. This was impossible, absolutely impossible according to everything he had been taught about the world. But the evidence stood before him in white fur and pale blue eyes, in sounds that no human throat should produce, and responses that no mere animal should give. The largest wolf had reached the canyon floor now, and Morrison could see that his earlier estimate of her size had been conservative. She stood easily 4.5 feet at the shoulder, her powerful frame dwarfing even the largest dogs he had ever seen. Her white coat seemed to shimmer with its own internal light, and when she turned those impossible blue eyes toward him, Morrison felt as though he were being examined by something far older and wiser than anything that should walk on 4 legs. Ayanna placed his hand gently on the massive wolf's shoulder, the gesture casual and intimate in a way that spoke of years of shared understanding. When he looked back at Morrison, there was something like compassion in his dark eyes. "Her name is Istis," he said softly. "It means snow in my language, though she is far more than her name suggests. She has walked these canyons for longer than your people have been in this land. She remembers when the first white men came, hungry and lost, and how my ancestors shared food and shelter with them. She remembers the promises that were made and the promises that were broken." The great white wolf made a sound deep in her throat, something between a growl and a sigh, and Ayanna nodded as if he understood perfectly. "She wants to know if you are the kind of man who honors his word, or if you are like the others who came before, men who take what they want and destroy what they cannot understand." Morrison felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. This was madness, standing in a canyon surrounded by impossible creatures while a young Apache claimed to translate their thoughts. But the alternative, that everything he was seeing was real, that there were forces in this world beyond the reach of money and law and superior firepower, was almost too terrifying to contemplate. "I honor my word when I give it to someone worth giving it to," Morrison heard himself say, though he had not consciously decided to answer the wolf's supposed question. Istis tilted her massive head, studying him with those penetrating blue eyes, and made another complex vocalization that Ayanna listened to with obvious attention. "She says you speak of honor, but your heart is full of fear and greed and old pain. She can smell the sorrow that drives you to take what belongs to others, the emptiness you try to fill with land and cattle and gold." Morrison felt his face flush with anger and embarrassment. How dare this Indian boy presume to know anything about his motivations, about the struggles he had endured to build his empire from nothing? "You don't know a damn thing about me or what I've been through." "The wolves know," Ayanna said simply. "They remember your grandmother's stories, the ones she told you when you were small and still believed in magic. They remember the promises you made to her before she died, promises you have spent 30 years trying to forget." The words hit Morrison like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs and leaving him momentarily speechless. His grandmother. How could this Apache possibly know about his grandmother, about the stories she had told him in a cabin in East Tennessee half a century ago? Stories about spirits that lived in the deep woods, about ancient pacts between the human world and the wild places, about what happened to those who forgot their connection to the natural world. "That's impossible," he whispered, but even as he spoke, Morrison could hear his grandmother's voice in his memory, could smell the wood smoke and cornbread of that long-ago kitchen where she had filled his young mind with tales of wonder and warning. Ayanna seemed to sense his inner turmoil, and when he spoke again, his voice was gentle with something that might have been sympathy. "Nothing is impossible in the places where the old agreements still hold power. Your grandmother knew the truth, that some things cannot be bought or sold or conquered, only respected. She tried to teach you, but the world convinced you to stop listening." The other wolves had descended now, forming a loose circle around the 3 humans and their horses. Up close, their sheer size was overwhelming, each animal easily capable of bringing down a full-grown bull single-handed. But there was no menace in their posture, only a watchful intelligence that suggested they were waiting to see what choice Morrison would make. "What do you want from me?" Morrison asked, his voice hoarse with emotions he had not allowed himself to feel in decades. Ayanna exchanged another complex series of vocalizations with the alpha female before turning back to face him. They want you to remember who you were before the world taught you to be afraid of your own heart. They want you to choose between the man your grandmother raised and the man you have become. Morrison looked around at the circle of white wolves, at their impossible size and ethereal beauty, at the ancient wisdom reflected in their pale blue eyes. Everything rational in his mind screamed that this was delusional, that he was having some kind of breakdown brought on by stress and desert heat. But deeper than reason, in places of the soul that he had locked away decades ago, he could feel the truth of what he was witnessing. These were not ordinary wolves. They were something else, something that belonged to an older understanding of the world than anything taught in schools or written in law books. They were living proof that the universe was larger and stranger and more wonderful than his pragmatic adult mind had ever dared to imagine. And standing in their midst was Ayanna, a young Apache warrior who possessed gifts that defied everything Morrison thought he knew about the boundaries between human and animal, between the natural world and the realm of spirit. The boy had not just claimed to speak with wolves, he had demonstrated it, had called them from their hidden places, and communicated with them in ways that transcended ordinary language. The realization should have filled Morrison with terror. Instead, it awakened something in his chest that he had not felt since childhood, a sense of wonder at the vast mysteries that surrounded human existence, a recognition that there were powers in this world that demanded not conquest but reverence. But acknowledging that would mean acknowledging that everything he had built his adult life upon, the assumption that strength came from taking what you wanted, that success meant imposing your will upon the world through superior force, might be fundamentally wrong. It would mean admitting that there were some things more valuable than money, some territories more sacred than any deed or title could make them. It would mean choosing between the empire he had built and the man his grandmother had tried to raise him to be. And as the morning sun climbed higher over the Arizona desert, painting the white wolves in shades of gold and silver, Morrison realized that he was standing at a crossroads that would determine not just the fate of this disputed land, but the very nature of his own soul. The choice, he understood with growing clarity, would define everything that came after. The silence stretched between them, like a taut rope ready to snap. Morrison's withered hands trembled as he slowly lowered the Winchester, the weight of his grandmother's forgotten stories pressing against his chest like stones. Istis stepped closer, her massive paws making no sound on the desert sand, and when she was close enough that he could feel the ancient power radiating from her white coat, she did something that shattered the last of his rational defenses. She spoke. Not in the complex vocalizations she had shared with Ayanna, but in words as clear and unmistakable as his own thoughts. The voice came not through his ears, but directly into his mind, carrying the weight of centuries and the wisdom of the eternal sky. Theodore Morrison, son of Mary who remembered the old ways, grandson of settlers who once knew how to listen to the land's heartbeat. Your grandmother's spirit weeps for what you have become. Morrison staggered backward, his face drained of all color. This isn't real. This can't be real. As the wolves moved in ancient patterns around the canyon floor, the air shimmered with visions of the past. Morrison saw buffalo herds moving across endless grasslands, Apache children playing by streams that no longer existed, and his own grandmother as a young woman, standing in a Tennessee forest with her hand resting on the flank of a wolf that looked exactly like Istis. Choose Theodore Morrison, Ayanna said, his words carrying the authority of ancient prophecy. Will you be the man who finally honors the old agreements, or will you be just another white man who takes what he wants and destroys what he cannot understand? Morrison thought of his dead cattle, of his territorial papers, of the empire he had built. Then he thought of his grandmother's stories, of the man she had tried to raise him to be before the world taught him that might made right. Slowly, Deliberately, Morrison set the Winchester down in the sand and stepped away from it. "What would you have me do?" he asked, his voice cracking like that of a child asking for forgiveness. Iona smiled with pure joy. "Help us protect what remains. Use your influence not to conquer the land but to preserve it. Become the guardian your grandmother always knew you could be." Istis touched Morrison's outstretched hand with her massive head, sending healing warmth through his entire body. "The white wolves will hunt no more of your livestock," Iona said, "but you must ensure that no other wolves are hunted in this territory. You must protect all the sacred places where the old agreements still hold power." Morrison nodded, feeling lighter than he had in decades. As the great white shapes faded back into the canyon walls, Morrison mounted his horse with the movements of a man transformed. When Patterson asked what had happened, Morrison's eyes held a peace absent for 30 years. "We found what was killing the cattle, and it won't be a problem anymore. Now we ride back to town and start making new arrangements about how we use this land." The sound that followed them from the canyon bridged two worlds, carrying on the desert wind like a song of gratitude, like a promise kept. And Theodore Morrison found himself whistling an old tune his grandmother had taught him 60 years ago, when the world was still full of magic and anything was possible for those who knew how to listen to its ancient songs.